Most people think of queens as women who ruled, but for most of English history, a queen was something else entirely. A woman beside the throne, not on it. And yet, beside that throne, some of the most consequential lives in English history were quietly being lived. Begin here. England, before it was fully England. The year is 871, and a young woman named Elswith moves into the royal household of Alfred of Wessex. She carries no crown yet. She carries no formal title. She is simply a noblewoman from Mercia, newly married to a king who will one day be called the Great. She lights no candles that evening, expecting history to notice her. But history does. Ealhswith is the first woman we can truly call a queen of the English people, even if she never used that word herself. Alfred never styled her queen in official documents, and yet she governed beside him through Viking invasions, through the siege of Winchester, through years of war and fear and rebuilding. When Alfred died in 899, she quietly founded a convent in Winchester and withdrew from public life. No coronation, no crown, just a life fully given to a kingdom that barely wrote her name down. That tension between presence and erasure would define the lives of English queens for 1,000 years. The Saxon era produced women of extraordinary intelligence and courage, most of whom we know only in fragments. Ethelfled of Damerham, Elfgifu of Shaftesbury, Edith of Wessex, who married Edward the Confessor and was known for her learning, her patronage of the arts, and her political acuity. She could read and write in multiple languages at a time when most men could not. She commissioned a biography of her husband that is still studied today. She outlived him, survived the Norman conquest, and died in 1075, a woman who had witnessed the complete transformation of England. She did not break. She adapted. And then there is Emma of Normandy, perhaps the most extraordinary woman of the entire pre-conquest era. Emma was queen consort not once, but twice, to two different kings of England. First to Ethelred the Unready, then after his death, to his conqueror and enemy, the Danish king Canute. She outlasted both of them. She buried two kings and watched two sons take the throne. She was politically cunning, possibly ruthless, certainly brilliant. A woman who understood that survival in the early medieval court was not a matter of sentiment. It was a matter of strategy. Think about what that required. A woman in the 11th century, navigating between English and Danish power, choosing allegiances that could end in exile or execution, never once losing her composure. Whatever you imagined a medieval queen's life looked like, it was more complicated than that. 1066 changes everything. William of Normandy defeats Harold Godwinson at Hastings, and with him comes a new world. New language, new law, new customs, new queens. Matilda of Flanders arrives in England not as a stranger to power, but as a woman who had already been managing Normandy in her husband's absence. She is described by contemporaries as small in stature, reputedly under 5 feet, but her authority was not small. She was crowned in Winchester in 1068, the first queen to receive a formal English coronation under the Normans. She administered Normandy, signed charters in her own name, and was trusted by William with decisions that had lasting consequences. When she died in 1083, William reportedly wept openly, something the chroniclers found remarkable enough to record. Her daughter-in-law, Matilda of Scotland, brings a different kind of significance. She is the woman who stitched the Norman and Saxon worlds together. Born to the Scottish king, Malcolm III, and the English princess Margaret, herself a saint, Matilda was educated by nuns, deeply pious, and deeply political. Her marriage to Henry I in 1100 was a deliberate act of dynastic healing. The Normans had conquered England. Matilda made peace between conqueror and conquered. She was known to wash the feet of lepers. She funded the construction of hospitals and a network of roads. And she governed England while Henry was campaigning in Normandy. Not ceremonially, but actually governed. She held court. She issued orders. She was, by any practical definition, a ruler. And yet, history gave the title of first queen regnant to someone else. That someone is the woman at the center of one of the most dramatic and most overlooked crises in English history, Empress Matilda. Her story deserves a moment longer than most. Matilda was the daughter of Henry I, trained to rule from childhood, declared his legitimate heir, and made the English barons swear an oath of loyalty to her. When Henry died in 1135, she had every legal right to the throne. She was denied it anyway. Her cousin Stephen of Blois simply rode to London, claimed the crown, and the barons, most of them, let him. Because she was a woman. What followed was 19 years of civil war, called the Anarchy. Matilda fought every day of it. She commanded armies. She negotiated alliances. In 1141, she was briefly recognized as Lady of the English, effectively queen, before political miscalculation and popular uprising reversed her position. She escaped a siege at Oxford Castle by crossing the frozen Thames on foot, dressed in white to camouflage herself against the snow. She never stopped fighting. She never got her crown, but her son did. He became Henry II, founder of the Plantagenet dynasty. Matilda lived long enough to see it. Close beside her story, and often overlooked beside it, is Matilda of Boulogne, queen consort to Stephen. While Empress Matilda was fighting for the throne, Matilda of Boulogne was fighting just as hard to keep it. She commanded Stephen's troops when he was captured. She negotiated his release. She was the strategic mind keeping the Blois claim alive. Two Matildas, on opposite sides of the same war, and neither of them ever formally recognized as queen regnant. Also, Adeliza of Louvain, Henry I's second queen consort, gentle, reportedly beautiful, famously learned, who founded an abbey after Henry's death and remarried a minor lord in quiet dignity. And Eleanor of Aquitaine, who became queen consort to Henry II, perhaps the most famous woman of the medieval world. She had already been Queen of France. She would outlive Henry, survive imprisonment, and launch a crusade. She governed England as regent. She died at 82, having shaped the politics of 3 countries across 7 decades. If she sounds extraordinary, she was. But she was also not unique in ambition. She was unique only in how much the record preserved of her. The Plantagenet centuries produce a particular kind of queen. Women who understood that their value to the crown was measured in sons, alliances, and silence, and who, in spite of that, refused to be silent. Eleanor of Castile, wife of Edward I, accompanied her husband on crusade. There is a story, likely legend, possibly true, that she sucked poison from his wound after an assassination attempt. What is certainly true is that when she died in 1290, Edward had 12 stone crosses erected along the route her body traveled to Westminster. The last of them, at Charing Cross, still marks where she rested for a night. His grief was public, architectural, lasting. Isabella of France is another matter entirely. She came to England as a bride of 12 to marry Edward II, a king who was politically inept, personally cruel, and, in the view of most historians, far more devoted to his male favorites than to his wife. Isabella endured. She raised a son. She traveled to France on diplomatic business. And then, at some point, she stopped enduring and began planning. She returned to England with her lover Roger Mortimer at the head of an army, deposed her husband, and ruled England as regent for her young son, Edward III. She was not queen regnant. She was something harder to name, the real power behind a throne, operating without any official sanction, in a world that had no category for what she was doing. The court of the 15th century brings us 2 more queens whose lives were dominated by the dynastic catastrophe of the Wars of the Roses. Margaret of Anjou, queen consort of the fragile, probably mentally ill Henry VI, was for years the actual military and political leader of the Lancastrian cause. She raised armies. She led campaigns. She fought at the Battle of Wakefield. She fought at the Second Battle of St. Albans. She was eventually captured and ransomed, and she died in France, impoverished, her cause lost. History has not been consistently kind to her. She has been painted as ruthless, as foreign, as too ambitious. But consider what she was actually doing, fighting for her son's right to the throne, in a war she did not start, with a husband who could not help her. Elizabeth Woodville is the other great queen of this age. She married Edward IV in secret, a widow from the wrong family, beautiful and clever, and despised by the Yorkist establishment. She outlasted them all. She survived 2 depositions of her husband, the death of her sons, the princes in the Tower, and the rise of the Tudors. She died in a convent, her retirement apparently not entirely voluntary. She left no diaries. She left no letters. She left a daughter who became the first Tudor queen consort, Elizabeth of York, whose face, scholars believe, was the model for the Queen of Hearts in a deck of playing cards. The cards have always held queens. They just rarely told you who those queens actually were. Here the narrative shifts, because the Tudor age gives England something it had never quite managed before. Women who actually wore the crown in their own right, and whose stories have never quite left us. Catherine of Aragon is where the Tudor queens begin. Though she was never queen regnant, she came to England from Spain at 16 to marry Prince Arthur, who died 5 months later. She waited, in poverty and uncertainty, for 7 years before Henry VIII married her. She gave him 6 pregnancies and 1 surviving child, a daughter, Mary. When Henry decided he wanted an annulment, Catherine refused, not out of stubbornness, but out of conviction. She believed the marriage was valid, that Mary was legitimate, and that no earthly king had the authority to override a papal sacrament. She argued her case in court in perfect, forceful English, a language she had learned as a foreigner. She lost everything. She died at Kimbleton Castle in 1536, alone, having last seen her daughter years before. Her final letter to Henry signed itself Catherine the Queen, the title she refused to surrender even at the end. She was followed, in quick succession, by the women Henry called his wives: Anne Boleyn, beheaded; Jane Seymour, died in childbirth; Anne of Cleves, divorced; Catherine Howard, beheaded; Catherine Parr, who survived him. Each one a story. Each one a life reduced, too often, to her relationship with a man who had legal authority over her existence. Anne Boleyn deserves her own sentence at minimum. She was witty, politically intelligent, a reformer who pushed Henry toward Protestantism, a patron of humanist scholarship, and a woman whose ambition was used against her the moment it became inconvenient. She was 28 or 29 when she was executed on charges that most historians believe were fabricated. But now, finally, England gets its queen's regnant. Lady Jane Grey reigns for 9 days in 1553. She is 16 years old, a scholar of exceptional ability who had been reading Greek and Hebrew, forced onto the throne by powerful men with their own agendas. She never wanted it. She said so. She was executed at 17, and her composure on the scaffold, asking the crowd to pray for her, reciting the 51st Psalm, finding the block by touch after a blindfold was tied over her eyes, was recorded by witnesses who could not quite believe her calm. Mary I follows her, and with her, the first confirmed Queen Regnant of England. Mary is complicated in ways that her nickname, Bloody Mary, flattens entirely. She was deeply educated, spoke 4 languages, was a skilled musician, and restored the full apparatus of English Catholicism with genuine conviction. She also burned nearly 300 Protestants at the stake. Both things are true. She married Philip II of Spain, endured 2 phantom pregnancies, presided over the loss of Calais, England's last French territory, and died at 42, convinced she had failed. She had not failed at everything. She had proven that a woman could rule England. It was at least a beginning. Elizabeth I built on that beginning for 45 years. She is so famous that brevity feels almost rude. But a few things stand out beyond the mythology. She never married. By choice, by strategic calculation, or both. She gave speeches of extraordinary power, including the address at Tilbury before the Armada, still quoted today. She kept her ministers waiting on her decisions for years, sometimes decades. She was vain, clever, unpredictable, and had an instinct for political theater that bordered on genius. She was also deeply lonely. Her closest relationships ended in execution, imprisonment, or betrayal. She died at 69, in silence, refusing to go to bed in her final days, as though she knew that once she lay down, she would not get up. The Stuart era brings Anne of Denmark, wife to James I, a lover of masks and theater, a patron of the arts, who built a collection of paintings that became the foundation of the royal collection. Henrietta Maria of France, wife to Charles I, Catholic, politically active, and deeply involved in the catastrophe that led to her husband's execution and her own exile. Catherine of Braganza, wife to Charles II, who brought Bombay and Tangier to England as part of her dowry, endured her husband's many mistresses with public grace, and introduced the custom of drinking tea to the English court. Mary II, who ruled alongside her husband William III as joint sovereign, the only such arrangement in English history, and died of smallpox at 32. Anne, the last Stuart monarch, who had 17 pregnancies and no surviving children, whose physical suffering was immense, and who presided over the Acts of Union that created the United Kingdom of Great Britain in 1707. 17 pregnancies, no surviving heir. She carried the grief of those losses into every room she entered. After 1707, England becomes Britain, and the queens of Britain carry the full weight of empire. Caroline of Ansbach, wife of George II, is one of the most intellectually formidable women to sit beside an English throne. She corresponded with Leibniz on philosophy. She championed smallpox inoculation at a time when the idea was deeply controversial, offering her own children for testing to encourage public acceptance. She managed her husband's political life. George relied on her judgment so heavily that when she died in 1737, he reportedly never fully recovered. Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, wife of George III, gave England 15 children and presided over a court known for its propriety and musicianship. She was a patron of botany. Kew Gardens owes part of its foundation to her interest. She was also present for her husband's devastating mental decline, navigating public life as queen while the king deteriorated behind closed doors. Queen Victoria arrived in 1837 at 18 years old, newly crowned, and would reign for 63 years. She was small, stubborn, grieving for most of her adult life. Albert died in 1861, and she mourned him, visibly and completely, until her own death in 1901. She wore black every day for 40 years. She kept his shaving water brought to his room each morning for decades after his death. She was also an empress, presiding over the largest empire in history, a constitutional monarch who nonetheless exerted enormous influence on political decisions, and a grandmother whose descendants would sit on the thrones of Germany, Russia, Norway, Sweden, Greece, and Spain. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, endured the Blitz in London, refusing evacuation with a quiet stubbornness that became the symbol of national endurance. Alexandra of Denmark, wife of Edward VII, known for her warmth, her charitable work, her lifelong nearness to the people. Mary of Teck, wife of George V, austere, dutiful, one of the great collectors of the royal collection, and a grandmother who watched her family survive the collapse of European monarchy. And then there is Elizabeth II, 67 years on the throne, the longest reigning monarch in British history. She came to the crown at 25, a young woman who had never expected to be queen. Her uncle Edward VIII abdicated, making her father king, making her heir. She gave her first public speech at 14, during the Blitz, speaking to the children evacuated from London. She served as a mechanic and military truck driver during the war. She gave her coronation address at 25. She shook the hands of Winston Churchill and of Rishi Sunak. She lived through the dissolution of the British Empire, the transformation of the Commonwealth, and every social revolution of the 20th and 21st centuries. She died at 96, quietly, at Balmoral in September 2022. Since her death, Camilla has been queen consort to Charles III, completing a circle from Matilda of Flanders, the first crowned Norman queen, to a woman who navigated decades of public scrutiny to stand eventually in Westminster Abbey with a crown on her head. The line runs more than 1,000 years. It runs from Ealhswith, walking quietly into Alfred's court, to Emma of Normandy outliving two kings, to Empress Matilda crossing a frozen river in the dark, to Mary I sitting on a throne the world said women couldn't hold, to Elizabeth I speaking at Tilbury with fire in her voice, to Victoria in black at a window, to Elizabeth II in a televised address during a pandemic at 93 years. Old, still steady, still present. The crowns changed, the palaces changed, the politics changed. The expectations on these women changed, slowly, sometimes painfully, never quite enough, but the thread runs without a break. And the thread, if you look at it closely enough, is made of something that has no better name than endurance. Endurance shaped, again and again, into something remarkably close to grace. If there is another place or time in women's history you would like us to reconstruct, a city, a century, a woman whose story you've always wanted to hear told this way, leave it in the comments below. Every name is a story worth finding.